So we talked about an evolutionary basis to criminality last time, okay? Now, if it is the case that there is some maybe predispositions being passed on from one generation to the next, we would have to look for evidence of this, right, in terms of heritability, okay, in terms of actual genes being passed on. So what we're going to do in today's study, today's lecture, is look at some of the genetic studies that have been done on this, adoption studies, twin studies, okay, and what's the kind of conclusion over the genetic basis to criminality. And then if it is the case that there is some genetic component to criminality, the next question might be, well, which genes are actually relevant? Which genes are carrying on this predisposition for violence? And so we'll take a closer look at that question as well. Just before I begin, let me kind of frame what it is that we're actually looking at, okay, when we're looking at measurements of antisocial behavior, for example. There's various ways in which this can be done. If it's in children, it might be whether they have a conduct disorder or not. In children, we don't diagnose them as having a personality disorder. It takes time for personality to develop. So we only do this with adults. But conduct disorder is a pretty early appearing behavioral issue, okay, associated quite heavily in childhood with antisocial personality disorder later in adulthood. Okay, quite often it does later predict it, so it's a sort of precursor. According to the DSM-5, if diagnosing a child with a conduct disorder, they must have 3 or more of these in the past 12 months, and at least one of them in the past 6 months. And then, of course, also be a child and not be of adult age. So, you know, some of these are to do with aggression, like bullying other children, getting into fights, using weapons, stealing, confrontation. Some of them are to do with property damage, other types of theft, other types of rule violations. So maybe, you know, running away from home, getting in trouble at school, and those sorts of things. But once one is of adult age, we then might diagnose them with an antisocial personality disorder. Okay, again, according to the DSM-5, this is a pervasive disregard for others or violation of others' rights. You must have 3 or more of these. So again, we have breaking social norms, deceitful behavior, impulsive aggression, a reckless disregard for one's safety or the safety of others, irresponsibility, lacking remorse. But also there must be an adult evidence of a conduct disorder with an onset before age 15. And then it must not be due to schizophrenia or bipolar, some of these, you know, behaviors that we're discussing, okay? They can't be explained by some other mental disorder. And that's kind of the things we might be looking for, okay, when we're looking to see if there's a genetic basis to some of these antisocial behaviors. So I'm going to tell you about a case. If you've taken my forensic psych class, you'll have came across this case before, but this is Jeffrey Landrigan, unfortunately born to pretty bad parents, okay, drug addicts and criminals, and he was taken away from the home. But by 6 months, he was adopted. And in 6 months, he was adopted into a pretty loving, average, middle-class family in Oklahoma. The dad was a geologist. They already had a little girl, and she grew up to be, you know, a good citizen of society. But even at a very early age, Jeffrey was showing poor impulse control, quick to anger, getting into fights, okay? Across his teenage years, he was getting into trouble for petty thefts and for minor crimes. And then it escalated and escalated, okay? Until one time he was having a conversation with one of his best friends. His best friend was having a baby and asked him if he would be the godfather. And somehow this conversation turned ugly, and Jeffrey Landrigan ended up killing this friend. He was arrested, convicted, but then managed to escape prison. He flew to Phoenix, Arizona, where he could have started anew, but his violent side came back to the surface, couldn't be controlled. This time he got into a fight at a Burger King in Phoenix, and this also escalated until he killed this man as well, and then again found himself convicted for murder. This time he found himself on death row, and when he was on death row, he was told, "You look like the spitting image of this other person who's also on death row for murder, a man named Darrell Hill." Indeed, they were spitting image, or he was the spitting image of Darrell Hill. And it turned out that he was the biological son of Darrell Hill. Okay. Furthermore, Darrell Hill's father, so Jeffrey's biological grandfather, had also been a career criminal, okay, and had been killed in a police shooting when robbing a drugstore. Okay. So what we have here is 3 generations of criminals. Okay. Jeffrey didn't know his biological father, okay, or his biological grandfather. Okay. He was raised in a pretty good environment. So when we were talking about cases last time that can't be explained only through social learning theory, okay, this would certainly be one example, right? There was one case, so we can't conclude too much, but it raises some interesting questions, right, over how much our genetics have to do with who we are and what the influence from genetics was on his criminal behavior. But in adoption studies, we can study this, okay? What we can have here in this study is children born to criminal parents and then taken away from them and adopted by non-criminals and raised by non-criminal parents, okay? We can therefore study, if you like, tens of thousands of little Jeffrey Landrigans, okay, to see if this is something that frequently occurs or what's the statistical probability of it. So what we have here by Mendick and colleagues in a Danish study is we have adoptees. Now, some of the children had biological criminal parents, some did not. Some are raised by adoptive parents who turned out to be criminal, and some are raised by, of course, adoptive parents who weren't criminal. And so what we have here then is 4 groups, right? And then later in life, we're recording criminal convictions, okay? What we see is if the biological parent was a criminal and the adoptive parents, then 24.5% of them, okay, grew up to have a criminal conviction. Okay? Pretty substantial proportion. If the adoptive parent was criminal, but not the biological parent, okay, it's substantially lower, okay, about between 14 and 15%. Not too different than the norm in this study if both parents weren't criminals, okay, which was 13 to 14%. So not statistically significantly different. Okay. If the biological parent was criminal, okay, but not the adopted parent, still a 28% chance that they'd grow up to have a criminal conviction, okay? Significantly higher than these other 2 scores, okay? So what this demonstrates that in this case, the influence from the biological parent was more powerful, was more influential, okay, than the adoptive parent. Now, we have dozens of studies just like this, okay, all pointing in the same direction. In some of these studies, there are some criticisms brought up. So some variables are hard to control. There's also the issue of selective placement. Selective placement is when children are adopted by parents who they think are similar to them in some way, okay? But also in some of these studies, they weren't all adopted at the exact same age. And so, you know, there's some possible confounding variables that are not being controlled. But in Mednick's study here, a lot of these variables are controlled, including the age in which the children were adopted. Okay, they've all been adopted at the same time. Yeah.
In those cases, were the crimes committed by the children similar to either of the parents, or was it just any?
I don't know if they looked at that. What I'm going to show you is that they did look at the crime of the parent, but I don't know that they looked at that in relation to the crime of the child. Yeah, but yeah, that would be interesting. And what Metnick found was that there was a genetic influence on all types of crime, okay? On crime in general, but also even on non-violent property theft, okay? And then also on violent crimes, okay? So across the spectrum, okay, it was having some influence on all the different types of crime. So it's not just that one might behave more violently if they have a violent parent, okay? But there's some other possible predispositions being passed on here, right? A disregard for others, right? A fearlessness, a selfishness, okay? Some other predisposition that may explain some other white-collar type crimes, okay, which are non-violent. Like I say, there's dozens of these studies. I'm going to give you another example just to illustrate the main takeaways. What we have here is a breakdown on not just whether it was the father who had the criminal conviction, the biological father, but also the influence of if the mother had a biological conviction. And what we see is in comparison to the norm for this study, okay? So what they've looked at is the crime rate across the adoptees in the study, but also they've looked at over 1.2 million non-adoptees in order to get a kind of norm, okay, for the typical crime rate. And if the adopted child had a father, biological father, with a criminal conviction, it's increasing the chances of them committing a crime 12%, okay, in comparison to the norm in this study, okay? And similar for if the biological mother had a criminal conviction, okay, a more than 13% chance in comparison to the norm. Again, there was heritability across crimes, for violent crimes, non-violent crimes, and there was no interaction effect, okay, between the biological and adoptive parent. What that means is it didn't matter if the adoptive parent was a criminal or not, okay? Regardless, there was still a significant influence from the biological parent, okay? This effect wasn't moderated, okay? Now, that might seem a bit depressing, okay, for those who are maybe adopting and raising, children who were born to biological parents with a criminal conviction. But there was some hope in the paper, and that was, well, I mean, you might interpret it as hope, but, it's only going to be relevant to some individuals, but parental education did matter, okay? Basically, if the adopted parent had completed high school, okay, then this helped protect against the influence from the genes, okay? In comparison to if the adopted parent hadn't completed high school education. That was the only kind of moderating factor when it came to the influence from the genes.
Do we only see like heritability in sons, or are there like statistics for daughters as well?
They're much harder to come by because, these sorts of studies are expensive to conduct and you need a large sample size. And there's 9 male crimes for every female crime, basically. So you would need to increase the sample size by almost 10 times, right? So it's going to be even more laborious, expensive, and time consuming. So it's difficult to do.
Did the increase if the biological father?
So I don't know that they looked at that in this particular study, but other studies have. And as you would expect, that further increases the chances. Yeah. Anything else? So that's one way of studying this, right? Which is whether children who were born to convicted criminals, if they have an increased chance of criminality, even if they're raised in a different environment, okay? That's one source of evidence when it comes to this type of research. The other type of research studies are twin studies, okay? Now, the most common type of twin study is comparing identical twins to non-identical twins, okay, to see if identical twins are more similar to each other than non-identical twins. Bearing in mind that non-identical twins come from separate fertilized eggs, they share about 50% of their genetic makeup, same as any other siblings. Because of a mutation, identical twins come from the same egg that then splits. So it's 100% of the genetic makeup or thereabouts that they share. Okay. When I say that 50% and 100%, let me put it in perspective, okay? Because obviously we all share a lot in common in terms of our DNA. We share a lot with all living things, okay? Because partly because of the information needed to have self-replicating cells, okay? So even with banana trees, we're 60% similar to, okay, in terms of our DNA. With other people, we're 99% similar. So what I'm talking about here is that 1%, okay? What I'm talking about is in relation to that 1% that's different between people, okay? Non-identical twins are 50% similar, okay? And identical twins are about 100% similar. So obviously, if identical twins are even more similar than non-identical twins, okay, then that would be some evidence in favor of a genetic component, okay? Because if the identical twins are raised in the same environment and the non-identical twins are raised in the same environment, right? But the identical twins are even more similar, right? Then what's different is that they're more genetically similar, okay? So that would be support of a genetic influence. One possible criticism of that that's brought up is the equal environments assumption, okay? That as researchers, we're assuming that identical twins are treated no more similar than non-identical twins and their respective households, okay? But identical twins are more likely to be dressed the same, for example. So you could argue that, you know, maybe identical twins are more likely to be treated the same, and maybe that's why they end up being more similar in comparison to non-identical twins, if indeed they are. So the very best type of research to do then would be to study identical twins who are reared apart as soon as they're born, okay, and raised in completely different environments, okay? And what we find is if those twins are highly similar, then it has to be because of the shared genetic information, because they were raised in different environments, so the environment can't explain the similarity, right? So that would be one marker of heritability, okay? It's a direct marker, okay? We can look at the correlation between identical twins reared apart at birth, okay? So if, for example, the correlation between them on a personality questionnaire is 0.5, then that means 50% of the variance is explained by genetics, okay? In fact, in personality, it is about 50% that's explained. It depends, of course, on the personality trait that's being looked at. Extroversion, for example, is more like 60%, but on average, it's about 50% of the variance that's explained by genetics when it comes to explaining differences in personality traits. And the same we find for antisocial behavior or criminality, okay? Now, what's interesting is it doesn't seem to matter what the outcome is we're measuring. We can measure rates of conduct disorder in children. We can look at early evidence of psychopaths in children. So this could be fearlessness or stimulation seeking, for example. We could look at other antisocial tendencies. We could look at antisocial personality disorder diagnoses in adulthood. We could look at violent criminal convictions. We could look at non-violent criminal convictions. We could look at arrest rates. It doesn't matter what the outcome is that we're measuring. They all point in the exact same direction, that about 50% of the variance is explained by genetics, okay? So it doesn't seem to matter the measurement. It doesn't seem to matter how old the participants are or what point in their life they are. It also has been done in multiple countries and cultures, okay? Again, with the same finding, that about 50% of the variance is explained. Now, the best type of study I talked about, twins separated at birth, is obviously very hard to do, okay? About 2% of the population are twins, about 8% of those are identical. And then finding ones that were reared apart at birth, they can then be traced down by psychologists, is obviously a very, very, very small number, okay? But still, there's been a couple of dozen of those types of studies done, okay? With adoption studies, there's also been dozens of studies. And with the identical twins versus non-identical twins, there's hundreds of studies being done. That's a more simple one to do. So at this point, we have in total across these studies, close to 10 million participants, okay? So what we're talking about is a large number of research studies pointing in the same direction. Out of all the studies that have been done, yes, you can find one or two, okay, that are different than the general consensus, but they really are exceptions, okay? The vast majority point in the exact same direction. And that's that 50% of the variance is explained by genes, okay? Now, you might think, well, you know, adoption studies might have their problems, twin studies might have their problems, okay? But they're all still giving the exact same results. And so that's giving further confidence to this as a solid, you know, reliable, rigorous research strategy, okay? Because even if there was problems with one or some other problems with another, it wouldn't explain why these separate independent research designs are all giving the same conclusions and findings. But if 50% is explained by genes, okay, that still means that 50% is explained by the environment, okay? Now, what I'm talking about here is that on average, 50% of criminality is explained by genes and 50% is explained by the environment, okay? It doesn't mean that in one individual case, okay, genes have explained 50% of that person's behavior or whatever. In some cases, the environment will matter more. In some individual cases, the genes will matter more, okay? If we're looking at cases in which someone was raised in a terrible, violent household, then it's not too hard to see how the environment has played a role. But if someone was raised in a pretty good household, no violence, anything like that, then we might, you know, speculate that this is when the genetics and biology is playing more of a role. But it's on average about 50% is explained by genetics. When it comes to the environment, we can split this down, okay, in terms of where the influence is coming from. The general consensus for a long time was that the shared environment was what's most important, right? What matters most is how your parents parent you, essentially, okay? But this was really challenged in the 90s by a review by Zuckerman, and then Zuckerman's findings have been supported ever since, okay? And this is a more recent review by Rain with over 200 of these twin and adoption studies with the same findings essentially as Zuckerman had in the 90s. That when it comes to the environment, the non-shared environment explains more than the shared environment. Now, when I say the shared environment, what I mean is that which is shared by the siblings, okay? So that which occurs within the household. The non-shared environment is that which isn't shared by the siblings, that which is uniquely experienced. So likely the peers that they have, okay? The teachers, you know, assuming that these things are different, okay? Anything that's uniquely experienced by the siblings. This counts for less than genetics, but counts for more than the shared environment. Now, as you can imagine, a lot of people are not too thrilled with hearing this news, okay? We can think of a number of reasons why, right? Parents don't want to think that their parenting strategies are in vain, okay? So there's some cognitive dissonance there, right? They want to see evidence of their good parenting, okay, in their children, okay? They don't want to think that their efforts have been pointless. But maybe what they're not acknowledging is the fact that there's going to be a strong correlation between how they parent and the genes that they're passing on, right? So you want a child who's going to be caring and empathetic, for example, and so you're caring and gentle with that child and nurturing, and that's your parenting style, then there's going to be some confirmation bias because you're going to see evidence of that child behaving gently and caring and say, well, that's because of how I parented, that's how I treated them. But what the parent isn't realizing is they've also passed on a genetic predisposition to be friendly, polite, caring, and empathetic, okay? They're not seeing this part, all they can really see is the parenting style. So that's also important to keep in mind, okay? One's environmental exposure is going to be strongly correlated with the genes that are passed on to them as well, okay? So similar, maybe you want to have a child who's interested in reading and intellectually curious, okay? And so yes, you'll tailor the environment to them. You'll have many books in the house and you'll read to them and so on. But you'll also likely be passing on some genetic predisposition to be curious about the world and be intellectually curious and to enjoy intellectual activities and so on. So that's the big picture, okay? I'm going to show you just a couple of examples to illustrate this. But remember, there's hundreds and hundreds of them, okay? That's the main takeaway already. These are just some examples. One meta-analysis in 97 on 24 of these gene studies found 50% explained by genetics, so 0.5 heritability. In one adoption study in Sweden, genes explained 49% of the variance, the shared environment 15%, the non-shared environment about 36%. Okay, so very, very similar findings to the large review by Rain. Okay, and there was no gender difference in heritability. Okay, that's important to keep in mind. Okay, these stats, better yet, these stats, though they're pretty much the same, are true for both males and females. Okay, neither are more influenced by genetics than the other. Okay, that's important to keep in mind, by the way, because I'm going to discuss later that there are some biological risk factors that males are more vulnerable to than females. Okay, so sometimes that can be confusing. Okay, but when it comes to heritability, it makes no difference. Okay, when it comes to sex. Okay. Yeah. Later in the course, we'll talk about abnormalities in fetal development, for example, the influence of neurotoxins, and we'll find that males are more vulnerable to this than females. In this study, they split aggression based upon proactive, instrumental, premeditated, and reactive. Now, this is one study. Don't take this as gospel, because there isn't many studies that go to the effort of splitting aggression this way, okay, into proactive versus reactive. I've seen some studies in which it wasn't quite as similar, and the variance explained was lower. But just another example, okay, of a source of evidence when it comes to the heritable component for both individual types of aggression. We have a Swedish twin study here, again, pretty similar. 54% explained by genes, 14% by the shared environment, 33% by the non-shared. What about psychopathy? Okay, so what we've looked at there is evidence of antisocial behavior, criminality. What about psychopathy? Now, the best way of measuring psychopathy is the psychopathic checklist, okay, that we'll talk more about. But there's also self-reports that can be used for certain types of studies, like the Levinson's questionnaire. Now, psychopathy is something we're going to talk a lot about later in the course, but you can think about it right now as an extreme personality disorder, okay? It's antisocial personality disorder, but at the extreme, okay? We're talking about, those who are especially fearless, stimulation-seeking, okay, and more likely to repeatedly reoffend, okay? What we find here, so a third to 56% explained by genetics, No influence in this particular study from the shared environment. If we look at some markers of psychopathy, so grandiosity, deceitful behavior, 57% explained by genetics, stimulation seeking in this study, 74% explained by genetics. In this Swedish study looking at psychopathy, 63% explained by genes, 0% by the shared environment, and 37% by the non-shared, okay? Now, it might make sense that if we're talking about very extreme, okay, so like psychopathy, there might be even more of an influence from genes in some cases, okay? Because as we're going to see quite often, those who score high in psychopathy from a very, very early age were incredibly hyperactive, fearless, stimulation seeking, okay? They were very, very difficult children to monitor, to socialize, to control, to have follow orders, okay? Now, it's not the case that these children are destined to be this way and that they can't be socialized, okay, as we'll discuss, but it's just much harder to socialize them than it is the typical child, okay? And this seems to largely be influenced by this biological temperament that seems to emerge pretty early in life. Even white-collar crime, okay? 54% explained by genetics, 17% by the shared environment, 29% by the non-shared, okay? So again, it doesn't have to be, violent acts. We're talking also here about, a predisposition for certain personality traits, maybe, that might make it more likely you'll be okay with stealing from others, okay? And, there's not much overlap between violent criminals and white-collar criminals, right? White-collar criminals are, usually non-violent, don't usually also have violent convictions, okay? So we're talking about, a different demographic. There does seem to be good evidence that there is a genetic component to criminality. Even the loudest critics of biological theories really have had to agree to the fact that there is influence. And the kind of general acceptance here now is that the nature-nurture debate has come out in a tie, okay? That there's, an influence from both. 50% is explained by genetics, 50% by the environment. So the next question might be, well, what genes are responsible, okay, for, passing on these predispositions for criminality? One of the earliest to have quite widespread support was the XYY syndrome. So, you have 23 pairs of chromosomes, right? The last pair is the one that determines sex. An XX pairing would equal female, XY is male. But sometimes in a mutation, the X pairs with not one Y, but with two Ys, okay? And this is called XYY syndrome. It's rare, it's found in 1 in 1,000 people, and it was first identified in 1961. What Jacobs found in a study on prisoners in Scotland, it was a facility of prisoners who had an intellectual disability. 4% of them had XYY syndrome. Now you might think that that's not very much, but comparing it to 0.01%, right, it's 40 times higher than the general population. July 1966, okay, the last time that England won the World Cup. Yeah. Something else was also happening, something pretty horrific. Spec murdered 8 student nurses, okay, in a student dorm at a university outside Chicago. There was actually 9 student nurses, and one of them managed to hid under the bed. He didn't notice her even when raping one of the victims. And when it came to leave, he thought he had miscounted, okay? And so he didn't go looking for this 9th potential victim, and she managed to survive, and then later testify against him and have him convicted. Now, during his trial and so on, there was speculation that he maybe had XYY syndrome. He had some of the markers. Those with XYY syndrome are usually very tall, usually above 6 feet. Spec was. The argument at the time was that those with XYY syndrome usually have acne, and Spec did have acne, but I don't think that's held up. I don't think there's any more good support for that being a marker for XYY syndrome. Those with XYY syndrome do usually have an IQ significantly below average, and there was pretty good evidence that Spec has an IQ below average. Evident from the fact he had miscounted 9 women, but also he had repeated a grade in school. He had dropped out of high school. Okay, so pretty evidence that he wasn't really intellectually capable. And it was argued that he had this syndrome, but actually it was eventually identified that he didn't have this syndrome. But this case was partly what was making it quite popular at the time for theorists and researchers to examine. Indeed, researchers did find some other support for this syndrome being more common to the criminal population. In Pennsylvania, 3.8%, so that's similar to the 4% by Jacobs. In 1976, okay, we have 42% of XYY in the general population are criminals versus about 9% of controls. That seems like quite a substantial difference. When it comes to violent criminals, okay, 8% of them have this syndrome, whereas only about 2% of the general population. But even though these numbers appear large in this study, the difference was statistically non-significant, okay, because the sample size was small, okay? And this was really giving attention to the fact that even though some of these studies have found what seemed to be quite large differences, they were not actually statistically significant because of the small samples in one of the conditions being compared. And this was really then when this theory kind of fell into disfavor, okay, and researchers kind of lost interest in looking at it any further. More recently, there have been some evidence that maybe those with XYY do report higher in aggression and delinquency. And this is the opposite way of looking at it, right? These previous studies have looked for evidence of XYY in criminals, okay? This study is looking at evidence of antisocial behavior in those who have already been identified as having XYY syndrome, okay? If there really is a connection between two things, we should be able to find a significant effect using both those different research designs, okay? Whether you're looking, at it from one angle, okay? So looking for XYY in criminals, or through the other angle, looking for criminality in XYY individuals. If it's a real connection, you should be able to find it either way. Yeah. So, in the kind of late 70s, it seemed to be the case that it had been put to bed, this argument that there was a gene responsible for criminality. Okay, there was a magazine article that was quite popular at the time, summing it up. It was wrong for two main reasons. Okay, the first is that even if this is not having an influence on criminality, okay, that doesn't then just throw into the trash everything that's been found in gene studies, okay, from the twin studies and adoption studies. That's all still pointing in the direction of a genetic component, okay? Even if it isn't this gene mutation that's responsible, still seems to be the case that there's something. That's the first point. The second point is that XYY isn't even heritable, okay? It's the result of a mutation. Doesn't matter if your father has XYY, that makes no difference to your chances as a son having XYY. It's not a heritable condition, okay? So it's the wrong way of looking at it anyway, okay, and the argument of nature versus nurture. But eventually, another argument came forward for another gene, this time the low activity variant of the MAOA gene, sometimes called the warrior gene in kind of popular fiction, or popular culture, rather. Now, what happened here was Brunner in the Netherlands was a gene or a genetics makeup counselor. And a woman came to him and said, there is something wrong with the men in my family, okay? The men in my family are violent, they're quick to anger. All of my brothers, my father, my grandfather, my uncles, the men in my family have a condition or something that's wrong, okay, because they seem to not be able to control their temper. They seem to get irritated very easily and get violent with a flip of a hat. And she was really becoming worried because she had a 10-year-old boy and she was actually becoming frightened of him. She was seeing signs in him that she had seen in her violent brothers and in her other violent male relatives. And he was also becoming really quite antisocial and not really having any regard for others. So it took Brunner 15 years, okay, to publish this paper looking at the family, okay, but during these 15 years, what he discovered was that indeed all of the 14 male relatives were indeed showing high impulsivity, reactive aggression, proneness for violence, criminality, okay? But interestingly, it was only those on one side of the family tree, okay, those who had been born to a woman in the family. So the son, okay, this 10-year-old boy, and then the mother's brothers, okay, and then her grandfather on the mother's side, okay. So what this is telling Brunner is that whatever is responsible for this, okay, is on the X chromosome on the 23rd pair, okay? And indeed, when he looked at this, what he found was a mutation with the MAOA gene, okay? Now, the MAOA gene is the gene that's involved in the reuptake of serotonin and dopamine. We're going to talk more about those, okay? And what these, all of these 14 male relatives, they had a low activity variant of the MAOA gene, okay? In fact, not only was it low in terms of his activity, but it was basically inactive, okay, completely inactive. Okay, so we'll go on to talk more about what the consequences of this would be, but it would equate to a serotonin deficiency, okay, which, as we'll talk about, increases one's irritability and emotional instability, okay. 2 years after this paper was studied, at a research lab in Southern California, researchers decided to investigate this further on mice. Now, in mice, you can actually remove a gene because you can replace it with artificial DNA coding. So what they did was, in a group of mice, they removed the MAOA gene, okay? And what they found was the other mice in the same cage as that mouse would end up dead, okay? Because this mouse without the MAOA gene was becoming incredibly aggressive, violent, hostile, and also much rougher mating behavior, okay? If you're interested in terms of how they coded this, they looked for various signs, okay? How quick the male was to court the female, but also the number of squeaks that the female produced during sex, okay? On average, a female mouse squeaks 20 times during sex, okay, according to the study. I don't just know that. But the female mice who were having intercourse with a mouse without this gene, they were squeaking on average 114 times, okay, with a standard deviation of 20. So it's a much, much higher number. And there's other markers as well that they looked, okay, but overall the males seem to be much more rough and aggressive during intercourse. But in really quite a groundbreaking study by Caspi, what was found was that when it comes to the influence of the low activity variant of the MAOA gene, it actually only seems to be relevant in cases of maltreatment. Okay, so what we have here is the influence of being physically abused or sexually abused as a child, or extreme neglect, some maltreatment as a child. We find a significant impact of this, okay, on antisociality in adulthood. There's no significant effect on its own when it comes to the low activity variant MAOA gene. But there is a significant interaction effect, okay, a moderating effect, okay. When one is poorly treated, the influence that that has on their antisocial behavior is actually threefolded in comparison to the control. But the impact of maltreatment is boosted, okay, by also having the low MAOA variant. So it's like a double whammy effect, right? If you have both of these factors, then it's increasing even further the chances of antisocial behavior. So, right, this is the low MAOA variant and severe maltreatment in childhood, right? If you have the normal MAOA gene, but also severe maltreatment, okay, yes, this is higher than average, right? But it's much, much lower, right, than it is when you have both the maltreatment and the low activity variants. When it comes to those who were treated well, okay, there's no evidence of maltreatment. There's essentially no difference, right, between having the low activity variant and the normal MAOA gene, okay? So that on its own doesn't seem to have an effect. It's only when it's in combination with other factors. Very, very similar. A few years later, the findings were basically replicated, okay? Again, what we have here is whether one was physically maltreated or not, and then whether they have the low activity variant MAOA gene or the normal gene. Again, no real difference, okay, so long as they were not physically abused, okay. But if they were physically abused, yes, the chances are higher anyway, okay, but it's even further higher if they also have this low activity variant. Another gene that's been identified as maybe being relevant is, or group of genes rather, genes to do with your dopamine receptors, okay? So there are some genes that have an influence on what you respond to in terms of getting a dopamine kick. So the DRD4 gene, for example, dopamine receptor D4, has been well linked to novelty seeking, okay? Those who have that gene are more likely to get a dopamine kick when they experience something novel, okay, something unconventional, something new, than people who don't have that, gene. We'll talk more about this next week when we talk about neurotransmitters, but dopamine is the neurotransmitter that encourages approach behavior, right? It encourages you to go after what you want, incentivizes you. So some of these related dopamine receptor genes have been linked to criminality, the most frequent of which is DRD2. But again, it only seems to be relevant when in the presence of other factors, okay? So in this case, the DRD2 variant was a risk factor, but only when the participants also suffered from some other stress, such as having been abused at home. Here too, an interaction between this gene and a criminal father predicted 5 antisocial phenotypes, this time among African American females. The 5 phenotypes were essentially contact with police and measurements of delinquency. In a study of 900 Finnish criminals, at least 5 to 10% of them carried the MAOA, low activity variant gene. And this is also relevant to dopamine, right? Because it's involved in the reuptake of dopamine as well as serotonin. And basically this low activity variant leads to a kind of dopamine hyperactivity, but especially when under the influence of alcohol and certain drugs. And then serotonin is another neurotransmitter we're going to talk about, but serotonin deficiency has been highly linked to impulsivity, emotional instability, impulsive crimes. You know, serotonin is that which dampens negative emotion, right? So it has you be bothered less by negative stimuli, for example. You're less easily provoked. You're more patient if you have a good level of serotonin, okay? You're going to be less irritable. You're going to be, you know, less anxious, less depressed as well. It's that which dampens these negative feelings. In one study, violent offenders and arsonists were followed up 3 years after their release from prison. Those with lower serotonin were more likely to reoffend than those with average levels of serotonin. So what gene causes violence? Well, in one large meta-analysis of 185 studies looking at various possibilities, there was no significant effects from any individual gene, only interaction effects. Okay, so there was only an influence from any of these genes in combination with an environmental factor or in combination possibly with another gene, but this is, you know, more theoretical. Finding individuals who have two of these genes, right, would be difficult from a research point of view. So that's more speculative, but it might be the case that, you know, some of these genes predispose one to criminality, but only in the presence of another gene, okay? But certainly there's good evidence that they're relevant when paired with environmental experiences like maltreatment. Any questions on anything I've covered here?